The road stretched before me, a ribbon of gray slicing through the heart of America's vast nocturnal landscape. Streetlights were scarce, their dim glow swallowed by the overwhelming darkness. My eyes felt heavy, weighed down by the relentless monotony of the drive and a fatigue that seemed to seep into my bones. I had been driving for hours, the endless road a hypnotic lullaby, when the sight of a supermarket emerged, an incongruous beacon in the desolation. Its neon sign flickered in the night, casting an eerie glow on the deserted parking lot. I was puzzled. A supermarket here, in the middle of nowhere. It was as though it had sprung up from the ground, born from the night itself. I pulled into the parking lot, gravel crunching under my tires, and killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute, a stark contrast to the low hum of the car's machinery moments before. I sat there for a moment, collecting my thoughts, the neon sign's flicker reflecting off the dashboard. Pushing the car door open, I stepped out into the cool night air. It was refreshing, a welcome reprieve from the stuffiness of the car. I stretched my limbs, my joints protesting with audible pops. As I approached the supermarket, a bell chimed above the door, announcing my entrance. The interior was bathed in fluorescent light, sterile and uninviting. There was a mustiness in the air, the scent of old produce and cleaning fluids. The owner, a man with a weathered face and a bored expression, glanced up from his magazine. "Evening," he muttered, his voice devoid of surprise or interest. He returned his gaze to the pages before him, uninterested in why a customer might find his way here at this late hour. I wandered the aisles, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the linoleum floors. The shelves were lined with cans and boxes, their labels faded and covered in dust. I picked up a can of soup, examining it under the harsh light. It felt like a relic from another time. As I made my way to the back of the store where the refrigerated goods hummed in their cool compartments, I felt a chill that wasn't from the air conditioning. It was a sensation that crept up my spine, a primal warning. Then, a scream shattered the silence. It was distant, yet piercing, a sound filled with terror and pain. I froze, the can of soup slipping from my fingers and clattering to the floor. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. The scream, still echoing in my ears, had jolted me into a state of primal fear. My breath became shallow, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. In the sudden silence that followed, a soft, unidentifiable noise seemed to creep through the aisles, like the rustling of leaves in a dead forest. Instinctively, I crouched behind a nearby shelf, my heart racing. I strained my ears, trying to discern any movement or sound. The fluorescent lights hummed above, the only constant in this surreal tableau. Time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity. I dared not move, my eyes scanning the shadows that danced along the aisles. The supermarket, once just a mundane stop, had transformed into a labyrinth of fear. Suddenly, the sound of a vehicle approaching broke the silence. My mind raced. Who could it be at this hour, in such a desolate place? I contemplated rushing out to warn them, but the memory of the scream held me back. What if whatever caused it was still lurking around? I inched towards the end of the aisle, peering cautiously towards the entrance. The owner was no longer at the cash register. Where had he gone? The store felt even more deserted, a void of human presence. As the vehicle came to a stop outside, I heard doors opening and closing. Footsteps approached, hesitant and slow. A chill ran down my spine. I was about to witness something, But what? The bell above the door chimed as new customers entered. A woman's scream pierced the air, a different tone from the first, but equally filled with terror. My pulse quickened. I had to see what was happening. I crept towards the entrance, each step deliberate and silent. There I saw a middle-aged couple, their faces frozen in horror, staring towards the cash register. The woman's hands were clasped over her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. Summoning courage, I stepped out of hiding. They recoiled at my sudden appearance, their fear palpable. I raised my hands, a universal sign of peace, trying to articulate that I was not a threat. "It's okay. I'm not. I didn't." My voice trailed off, unsure of what I was trying to communicate. "Be quiet," I whispered urgently. "We don't know what's here." They nodded, their bodies tense, ready to flee at any moment. Together, we approached the cash register, the source of their terror. The sight that greeted us was macabre. The store owner lay on the ground, his body twisted in an unnatural pose, a pool of blood spreading around him. His lifeless eyes stared at the ceiling, reflecting the harsh fluorescent light. A gasp escaped my lips. The couple clung to each other, their faces a mask of shock and fear. The reality of the situation was overwhelming. We were in grave danger, and we needed to act. But first, we had to understand what had happened here. Who, or what, had done this? And more importantly, was it still nearby, hiding in the shadows, waiting for us? The air in the supermarket felt heavier, charged with a malevolent energy. Every creak of the building, every flicker of the lights sent shivers down my spine. We were not alone. The air was thick with tension, our minds grappling with the grim reality before us. The chime of the doorbell cut through the silence, snapping us back to the present. We turned, startled, to see another man entering the store. His initial confusion at seeing us huddled together quickly turned to horror as he caught sight of the body. The newcomer, a tall figure with a rugged appearance, staggered backwards, hand covering his mouth as nausea overwhelmed him. We exchanged anxious glances, the unspoken fear in our eyes mirroring each other's. Realizing the need for action, I suggested calling the police. But as we each pulled out our cell phones, a sinking feeling set in. No signal. The isolation of our location had become our enemy. "We need to find a landline," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The group nodded in agreement, and we began a frantic search for a stationary phone. The supermarket seemed larger now, each aisle a potential hiding place for more horrors. Finally, we found the phone, but our hope was short-lived. The cord had been deliberately cut, rendered useless. A collective sense of despair washed over us. We were cut off from the world, trapped in this nightmare. Gathering in an aisle, we introduced ourselves in hushed tones. The new arrival was John, his face still pale from the shock. The couple, Mark and Sarah, clung to each other, their eyes wide with fear. As we started to discuss our next steps, the sound of the doorbell chimed again. 3 more people entered, their faces etched with the same confusion and fear that had gripped us moments before. They froze at the sight of the group and the visible bloodstains on the floor. "We have to leave now," one of them exclaimed, panic in his voice. The atmosphere was electric with fear, everyone ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. But where could we go? The night outside was dark and unwelcoming, the road seemingly endless. And yet, the supermarket had become a place of death and dread. Staying here felt just as dangerous as venturing out into the unknown. We hastily explained the situation to the newcomers, their faces turning ashen as the reality of our predicament sank in. There were now 8 of us. 8 scared souls bound together by a twist of fate in this desolate place. The decision was made to leave in a group, to stick together for safety. We gathered whatever supplies we could find: bottled water, canned food, a few flashlights, and prepared to step out into the dark night. But as we approached the door, a sense of foreboding gripped me. What if whatever caused this was still out there, lurking in the shadows? We were about to step into its domain, unarmed and vulnerable. I glanced back at the lifeless body of the store owner, a silent sentinel to the horror that had unfolded here. What secrets did he take to his grave? What unseen danger lurked just beyond our perception? With a deep breath, we pushed open the door, stepping into the cool night air. The supermarket, with its flickering neon sign, stood behind us like a tombstone marking the end of normalcy. We moved towards the parking lot, a sense of urgency propelling us forward. The cool night air brushed against my skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of the supermarket's fluorescent bulbs. As we stepped outside, the vast emptiness of the landscape engulfed us, a desolate backdrop to our growing unease. The parking lot, a patch of gravel and dirt, lay to the side of the supermarket. It was bathed in a dim, almost ghostly light from the few functioning street lamps. Our footsteps crunched underfoot, a chorus of anxiety and anticipation. Upon reaching our cars, a collective gasp escaped our lips. Each vehicle had its tires slashed, deflated, and useless. Mark knelt down, inspecting the damage. "Looks like they've been cut with a knife, or something like claws," he said, his voice trembling with disbelief. Jack, one of the new arrivals, pointed out something even more alarming. The fuel tanks of the cars had been ruptured, gasoline pooling beneath them, reflecting the moonlight in sinister, shimmering patches. The realization hit us like a wave of cold water. We were stranded. Panic began to set in. Emily and Anne, the other 2 newcomers, clung to each other, their faces pale with fear. Seeing their distress, Jack suggested taking them back to the light and relative safety of the supermarket. Left to inspect the cars, Mark, Sarah, John, and I exchanged worried glances. "What now?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. We felt exposed, vulnerable in the open space of the parking lot. As we discussed our limited options, a sudden, blood-curdling scream pierced the night. It came from the direction of the supermarket. Without a word, we sprinted towards the building, fear lending speed to our steps. The supermarket loomed before us, its flickering neon sign casting an eerie glow. The bell above the door rang violently as we burst inside, our hearts pounding in our chests. Our breaths were ragged, hearts pounding as we reached the supermarket. The flickering neon sign cast a haunting glow, illuminating a scene of unimaginable horror. The bodies of Emily, Anne, and Jack lay before us, torn and twisted in unnatural positions, their lifeless eyes staring into nothingness. We stood frozen, the shock paralyzing us as we stared at the carnage. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, a stark reminder of our vulnerability in this nightmarish reality. The urge to flee was overwhelming, every instinct screaming to escape this place of death. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from within the supermarket, snapping us out of our trance. A shelf had collapsed, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silence of the night. It was the trigger we needed. Mark, driven by primal fear, grabbed Sarah's hand and bolted, with John following close behind. I remained, my gaze fixed on the interior of the supermarket, trying to comprehend the chaos. That's when the alarm blared to life, its piercing siren slicing through the night. And in that moment, amidst the cacophony of sounds, I saw it. A silhouette in the shadows. It was an abomination, a grotesque fusion of wolf and man, but far more twisted and repulsive. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent intelligence, a predator sizing up its prey. My legs finally found their strength, and I ran, following the others into the moonlit night. The clouds gathered overhead, casting us into darkness as the lunar light waned. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, a frantic drumming that matched my steps. But I was slower, the terror and shock weighing me down. Soon I lagged behind the others. My breaths were short and labored, each inhale a struggle against the fear that threatened to consume me. Eventually we had to stop, our bodies no longer able to sustain the frantic pace. We huddled together, panting and wide-eyed in the middle of the road. The night was oppressively silent, the sound of our heavy breathing the only sign of life. Then, from somewhere in the distance, came a howl. It was a long, mournful sound, filled with an ancient hunger and rage. It was the call of the beast, a sound that chilled us to our very souls. We exchanged terrified glances, realizing we were not the hunters in this game. We were the hunted, and the beast was closing in. The realization brought a new wave of panic, a desperate need to find shelter, to find safety. But where could we go? The supermarket was a death trap. The cars were useless, and the vast, open road offered no protection. We were exposed, vulnerable, and every shadow seemed to hide unspeakable horrors. "We need to keep moving," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's out there, waiting for us." We set off again, each step a battle against the fear that gripped our hearts. The howl of the beast echoed in our minds, a haunting reminder of the nightmare that had become our reality. The night stretched on, endless and unforgiving. We were lost in a world of shadows and terror, with only the faint hope of dawn to guide us. Our feet pounded the pavement, the rhythmic thud a desperate mantra against the enveloping darkness. The road stretched endlessly before us, a vacant artery in the heart of a desolate landscape. Every so often I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the monstrous silhouette pursuing us. The hope of encountering another soul on this forsaken road was dwindling with each passing moment. Night had fully descended, its cloak of darkness punctuated only by the stark light of the full moon above. I pulled out my mobile phone, the screen a feeble light in the overwhelming darkness. No signal. We were still cut off from the world, alone in our plight. As we trudged forward, the distant howl pierced the night once more, sending a shiver down my spine. It was closer this time, a haunting reminder that our pursuer was still out there, biding its time. Panic surged through us, and we broke into a run again. Our breaths came in short, sharp gasps, the cold air stinging our lungs. The relentless fear propelled us forward, the instinct to survive overriding all else. We had been running for what seemed like an eternity when a glimmer of hope appeared on the horizon. Headlights cut through the darkness, growing steadily closer. Our hearts leaped with renewed hope. Salvation at last, it seemed. We positioned ourselves in the middle of the road, arms waving frantically. The vehicle, a modest sedan, screeched to a halt mere inches from us. The driver, an elderly man with a face etched with lines of time, peered out, his expression a mix of confusion and fear. In a frenzy, we pleaded for his help, our words tumbling out in a torrent of desperation. After a moment of hesitation, he unlocked the doors and we clambered inside, a tangle of limbs and relief. John took the passenger seat, while Sarah, Mark, and I squeezed into the back. We urged the man to turn around, to drive away from the lurking horrors of the supermarket and whatever lay beyond. As the car turned and picked up speed, I saw the relief wash over my companions' faces, a brief respite in our night of terror. But when my gaze fell on John, my heart sank. His eyes darted nervously, his body tense, as if bracing for something. His unease was palpable, infecting the rest of us with a renewed sense of dread. What did he see? What did he know? Without warning, John lunged at the driver, his hands grappling for the steering wheel. The car swerved violently, the world outside spinning in a dizzying blur. Shouts and screams filled the air, a cacophony of terror and confusion. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the world went silent. The car had flipped, tumbling into a ditch by the side of the road. We hung suspended in our seats, the only sound our ragged breathing. As I struggled to comprehend what had just happened, the weight of John's actions bore down on me. What had driven him to such madness? Was it fear, or something more sinister? In the dim light of the car's interior, I saw the fear in my companions' eyes turn to confusion, and then horror as they looked at John. His face was a mask of desperation, his eyes wild and unseeing. The aftermath of the car crash left us dazed and disoriented. Crawling out from the wreckage, we each bore the weight of our collective disbelief. Helping Sarah and Mark out, I couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare. We all turned to John as he emerged, his body shaking uncontrollably, an unnerving sight that sent chills down my spine. Sarah's voice broke the tense silence, laden with despair. "John, why? Why did you do this?" But the man who faced us now was a distorted version of the friend we knew. His eyes were wild and his speech was erratic. "Where to carry this fool? I'll have to deal with you myself, sorry guys." His voice, barely recognizable, was a harbinger of the horror that was to unfold. The transformation was grotesque and seemed to defy the laws of nature. John's neck stretched unnaturally, his skin rippling as coarse hair sprouted across his body. His face contorted, elongating into a snout, while his teeth morphed into sharp, predatory fangs. The sight was so profoundly disturbing that it rooted me to the spot, my mind struggling to process what my eyes were witnessing. There in the moonlight stood a creature of legend, a werewolf, towering and ferocious. My legs trembled, every instinct screaming to flee. Yet for a moment I was frozen in place, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the scene before me. It was Mark who broke the paralysis, his survival instincts kicking in. He bolted, with Sarah following close behind him. The realization hit me like a cold wave. We had to scatter, to divide the beast's attention if any of us were to have a chance at survival. As the werewolf shook its massive head, seemingly disoriented by its own transformation, I seized the moment. I turned and ran in the opposite direction, my heart pounding in my chest, the beast's howls reverberating through the night air. I could hear its heavy footsteps behind me, the sound drawing closer with every passing second. I pushed myself harder than I ever thought possible, my lungs burning with each breath. The fear was a tangible force, driving me forward even as my muscles screamed in protest. I dodged through trees and leapt over bushes, the underbrush tearing at my clothes and skin. Somewhere in the distance I heard a scream, a sound so filled with terror that it spurred me to run even faster. The realization that the beast had chosen to pursue Mark and Sarah first was both a relief and a curse. Relief, because it gave me a chance to escape. A curse, because it meant my friends were in mortal danger. I continued to run, my mind a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline. The night seemed endless, a labyrinth of darkness with no sign of safety or respite. Every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig underfoot sent waves of panic through me. I was lost in a world of primal fear, where every shadow hid potential death. Then, without warning, the ground beneath me gave way. I fell, tumbling into darkness, the world spinning around me until I crashed into the cold, hard earth. Pain shot through my body, and then everything went black. When consciousness returned, it was daylight. Sunlight streamed into the pit, blinding me momentarily. Pain racked my body as I tried to move, each muscle aching from the fall and the night's exertions. It took several agonizing attempts to pull myself out of the pit. Standing at the edge of the hole, I looked around. The daylight revealed a wild, unfamiliar terrain. The night's horrors seemed almost unreal in the harsh light of day. I stumbled towards the road, each step a testament to the previous night's terror. As I reached the road, a police car appeared. I waved my arms, relief flooding through me. The officers were cautious but listened as I recounted the harrowing events. Their skepticism was evident, and my heart sank with the realization that my story, as unbelievable as it was, might never be accepted as truth. They drove me back to the supermarket. The place was now a hive of activity, with police and onlookers everywhere. I was interrogated by a senior officer, his expression one of polite disbelief. The futility of my situation weighed heavily on me as they placed me in the police car destined for the station. As we drove, the memories of the previous night haunted me. The nightmare I had lived through seemed almost too surreal to believe. Sitting in the back of the car, I realized the harsh truth. In a world of rationality and logic, my story of horror and werewolves would always strain credulity. The car journey was a blur, my mind replaying the events over and over. The werewolf, the screams, the chase. It was a tale ripped straight from a horror film, yet it was my reality. And in that moment, the sinking feeling that no one would ever believe my story settled deep within me. Story 2. As the relentless sun scorched the vast, seemingly boundless Syrian desert, I, Captain John Hawkins, stood steadfastly by the colossal MTT truck. My gaze was fixed on the meticulous loading of vital communication equipment. The air was filled with the gruff shouts of the loaders, a cacophony that underscored the significance of our task. Each crate, especially the large one that was the centerpiece of our cargo, was handled with a reverence that bordered on the religious. This crate, sealed tightly and peppered with mysterious holes, piqued my curiosity. But protocol and the stern looks from the overseeing government officials kept my questions at bay. Among these officials, several individuals in nondescript civilian attire stood out. They kept their eyes hawk-like on the cargo, particularly the enigmatic large crate, suggesting its contents were of extraordinary value. Our mission was deceptively simple yet of paramount importance. Transport this cargo from the ancient storied city of Palmyra to Deir ez-Zor, a journey that under normal circumstances would take about 6-8 hours along the M20 highway. However, these were not normal circumstances. The route cut straight through the heart of the Syrian desert, a land infamous for its unforgiving heat, sudden and blinding sandstorms, and the ever-present threat of ambushes by local bandits. It was a land that tested the mettle of even the most seasoned travelers. Thus, our squad of 10, bolstered by the presence of 5 government officials, was tasked with ensuring the safe passage of this mysterious cargo. Our preparations had been thorough. Each member of the team was a seasoned veteran, handpicked for their expertise and experience in such high-risk operations. The air was thick with tension, a silent acknowledgement of the dangers that lay ahead. The final piece of equipment was secured with a resounding click, signaling the end of our preparations and the beginning of our perilous journey. I made my way to my designated vehicle, the heart of our convoy. The truck was an imposing beast, its engine rumbling like distant thunder. Inside, I was joined by Lieutenant Smith, a man of few words but unshakable composure, and Mr. Jefferson, a tall, enigmatic figure from the government whose age seemed hard to place. He carried himself with an air of authority that demanded respect. Our convoy was a formidable sight. Leading and trailing were two heavily armored MRAPs, their mounted machine guns casting ominous shadows. Our truck, carrying the precious cargo, was sandwiched securely in the middle. Flanking us were a couple of sleek SUVs, their tinted windows hiding the government officials, who were as much a mystery as the cargo we were transporting. The journey began with the slow, lumbering movement of our convoy out of the private courtyard where the loading had taken place. We passed an old Arab stone house, its architecture a testament to the region's rich history. Its high, narrow windows overlooked an inner courtyard, where a once vibrant fountain now lay silent, a mute witness to the passage of time and the stories it carried. The local children, their faces a mixture of curiosity and awe, clustered along the road, their excited chatter and pointing fingers a brief, heartening distraction from the weight of our mission. As we left the confines of civilization, the terrain shifted. The road became a mere dirt track, a precursor to the vast open desert that lay ahead. The landscape around us was a tapestry of extremes, endless dunes that rose and fell like the waves of a petrified ocean, their golden hues ever changing with the sun's position. Here and there, hardy shrubs clung to life, their existence a defiant stand against the harsh, arid climate. The air was thick and hot, a tangible presence that seemed to press against us with an almost physical weight. The sky was a relentless expanse of blue, unmarred by clouds, its vastness a reminder of our insignificance in the face of nature's grandeur. The silence of the desert was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the noise and chaos of the loading area. It was a silence that spoke volumes, filled with the whispers of ancient sands and the secrets they held. In this desolate expanse, the sun was a merciless overseer, its rays beating down upon us with an intensity that seemed to penetrate to the very core. The heat was more than just a physical sensation. It was an ever-present force, an adversary we had to contend with every moment. The shimmering heat haze on the horizon danced and distorted the landscape, creating mirages that toyed with our senses. Our convoy trudged along, a metallic beast crawling through the ancient sands. Inside the truck, the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio were the only sounds that pierced the overwhelming silence. The atmosphere was one of solemn anticipation, each of us lost in our own thoughts, mentally preparing for the journey ahead. I glanced at Mr. Jefferson, who sat stoically, his eyes fixed on the horizon. His demeanor was an enigma, calm yet unreadable, adding another layer of mystery to our mission. Lieutenant Smith, ever the professional, kept his focus on the road, his hand steady on the wheel despite the rough terrain. As we approached the M20 highway, the landscape began to change subtly. The endless dunes gave way to flatter, more navigable terrain, though the oppressive heat and the blinding brightness of the sun remained constant companions. The highway itself, a lifeline cutting through the desert, stretched out before us, a ribbon of tarmac that represented both our path forward and the challenges that lay ahead. I broke the silence, my voice sounding strangely loud in the confines of the truck. "Mr. Jefferson, this cargo we're transporting, can you tell us anything about it?" I asked, my curiosity getting the better of me. He turned his gaze to me, his eyes revealing nothing. "It's just equipment, Captain. Nothing for you to worry about," he replied, his voice even and unemotional. I nodded, though his response did little to quell my curiosity. Beside me, Lieutenant Smith opened his mouth as if to speak, then seemed to think better of it. He turned his attention back to the road, a silent acknowledgement that some questions were better left unasked. As we merged onto the highway, our speed increased, the convoy settling into a steady rhythm. The landscape blurred past us, a monotonous blend of sand and sky. As the relentless sun bore down upon us, our convoy, a line of dust-covered vehicles, wound its way through the Syrian desert. The silence inside the truck was as dense as the heat outside. Only the steady hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio broke the monotonous drone. I sat deep in thought, my gaze occasionally drifting to the barren, sun-bleached landscape that stretched endlessly on either side of the highway. A fleeting glimpse of a desert fox, a rare sight in these arid lands, momentarily captured our attention as it darted across the road. Its russet fur was a stark contrast against the pale sands, a fleeting moment of life in an otherwise lifeless expanse. It was in this moment that Mr. Jefferson chose to speak. "Captain, how long have you served in Syria?" he asked, his voice smooth yet carrying an undercurrent of curiosity. "Nearly a year, sir," I replied, maintaining a professional demeanor. He nodded thoughtfully before delving into a topic seemingly unrelated to our current task. "You must have had extensive contact with the locals. Have you ever heard about the wild asses that once roamed here?" he inquired. His question caught me off guard. "No, sir, I haven't. My focus has been elsewhere," I responded, slightly puzzled by the sudden shift in conversation. Clearly, the Syrian wild ass, Equus hemionus hemippus, a subspecies of the wild ass, once inhabited the Middle East. Smaller and more resilient than its counterparts, adapted to the arid desert conditions it struggled to survive. Yet, despite its efforts, it became extinct, succumbed to hunting and habitat loss. Humans are cold and merciless, and in the war against them, one must either hide from them or adapt to become useful, to not interfere. This is the path to survival. The Arabs have a legend. In the endless deserts of the Middle East, caravans whispered legends of a ghoul named Zahira. She was a night creature, a twisted echo of her former human self. Zahira lived in the ruins of ancient cities, luring unsuspecting travelers with the guise of a young, seductive woman. Those who succumbed to her charms ended up in her lair, never to return. It is said Zahira was once a princess who fell victim to a curse for her pride and cruelty. Transformed into a ghoul, she roamed battlefields and graveyards, feeding on the dead. She could transform into various forms, often appearing as a hyena or reverting to human form to deceive her prey. The only way to defeat Zahira was with a single, decisive weapon strike. A second strike would revive her. I listened, intrigued yet wary. "An interesting story," I finally said, trying to gauge his intention behind sharing such a tale. Meister Jefferson's response was a thin smile. "Imagine if the wild asses had adapted like Zahira. Would they have met the same fate? Adaptation, Captain, is the key to survival. And perhaps it's not just the domain of rats and cockroaches," he mused, his smile widening just a fraction. The conversation dwindled, leaving me to ponder his words. I reflexively checked my pistol, a habit ingrained from years of service. His talk of mythical creatures and the parallels he drew with our mission left me unsettled. I felt a sudden dryness in my throat and reached for my water flask, unscrewing the cap and taking a long sip. But then a sound from behind, a distinct thud, made me choke on the water, coughing as I hastily turned around. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror, but all I saw was the dusty road and the convoy trailing us. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice laced with concern. Lieutenant Smith, our driver, gave a brief nod, his expression tense. Mr. Jefferson, however, remained calm, almost unnervingly so. After a brief silence, he simply said, "Pay it no mind." His nonchalance did little to ease my growing sense of unease. What were we carrying in this convoy that warranted such secrecy and protection? Before I could probe further, the unexpected happened. The vehicle ahead came to a sudden grinding halt, sending a jolt through our truck as we braked hard. Without hesitation, I grabbed my rifle and exited the truck. My eyes scanned the surroundings. The stark, unyielding desert offering no clues. The heat was a palpable force, waves of it distorting the air and blending the horizon into a mirage. The road, once a symbol of connection and progress, now resembled a war-torn landscape, riddled with deep craters and littered with debris. Massive chunks of asphalt lay scattered like the remnants of some forgotten battle, a stark reminder of the conflict that had ravaged this land. My eyes surveyed the destruction, a knot of apprehension tightening in my gut. Lieutenant Harris, leading the convoy in the first vehicle, approached me with a grave expression that mirrored my concern. "Captain, this route is impassable," he stated, pointing to the ravaged highway. "Our best option is to detour through the desert and loop back to the road further on." His voice carried the weight of experience, one honed in the crucible of countless missions. The desert, though seemingly empty, was fraught with hidden dangers. Mines could be buried beneath the innocent-looking sands, and the occasional scrubby bushes provided ideal cover for insurgents. I scanned the horizon, the vast expanse of sand stretching out in every direction, feeling the weight of the decision upon me. It was then that Mr. Jefferson, the enigmatic government official who had been a constant presence of mystery, joined our discussion. His gaze lingered on the devastated road before us. "We need to move quickly, Captain," he said, his voice laced with urgency. "We don't have the luxury of time. Take the detour." His words brooked no argument, and I could sense an underlying importance in his tone that went beyond our immediate predicament. Reluctantly, I issued the order. A scout vehicle moved ahead, cautiously navigating the treacherous off-road terrain, while we maintained a safe distance. The journey was jarring. The vehicle shook violently as it traversed the uneven desert. Amidst the tumultuous ride, the mysterious thumping from the cargo area returned, more insistent than before. I cast a questioning glance at Mr. Jefferson, frustration edging my voice. "What in God's name are we carrying?" His response was curt, delivered with a commanding authority that brooked no further inquiry. "Ignore it, Captain. That's an order." His words echoed in my mind as we continued our journey. The soldiers around me shared looks of unease, each man battling his own thoughts and fears. Eventually, we navigated the rough terrain and rejoined the highway. The soldiers' tension was palpable, eyes constantly roving, hands gripping their weapons a little tighter. The gunner swiveled ceaselessly, vigilant against any potential threat. Despite the ever-present danger, we encountered no further obstacles and accelerated along the highway. The road ahead stretched into the distance, flanked by small cliffs and mountains that heralded a more dangerous terrain. The looming canyons were notorious for their treacherous turns and hidden crevices, perfect for ambushes. As we entered a narrow canyon, the towering rock walls closed in around us, their imposing presence casting long, dark shadows across our path. The canyon was a stark, rugged beauty, its walls a tapestry of reds, oranges, and browns, carved by the relentless forces of nature over millennia. The narrow path wound its way through the towering cliffs, the silence of the desert amplified by the enclosing rocks. Here, in this ancient corridor carved by wind and time, we were acutely aware of our vulnerability. Small shrubs and hardy plants clung to life in the crevices, their stubborn existence a testament to the harshness of this environment. We proceeded with heightened caution, the convoy tightly knit as we navigated the serpentine path. My eyes darted from shadow to shadow, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of danger. The soldiers were tense, their training and instincts on high alert. The atmosphere was charged, each of us braced for the unseen and the unexpected. It was about 5 minutes into the canyon when my gaze fell upon something unsettling. A kufiya, its red and white fabric barely visible against the rocky backdrop. A surge of adrenaline shot through me as I grasped the full implication of what I was seeing. Danger was imminent. I reached for the radio to alert the others, but my actions were too slow. From behind a large boulder, a figure appeared, brandishing a rocket launcher, the unmistakable silhouette of a Soviet-made Igla anti-tank system. Time seemed to slow as I watched him launch the missile, its trail zigzagging through the air towards us. I yelled a warning, but it was lost in the cacophony of the ensuing explosion. The world erupted in chaos. The force of the blast sent shock waves through the convoy, and our vehicle, caught in the maelstrom, was violently tossed. I could hear the screeching of metal, the shattering of glass, and the shouts of my men, all melding into a symphony of destruction. The impact was like a hammer blow, throwing me against the interior of the truck. My head spun and my vision blurred, the line between consciousness and darkness wavering precariously. As consciousness slowly seeped back into my mind, I found myself being dragged across the rugged terrain of the Syrian desert. The ground beneath me was a patchwork of coarse sand and sharp rocks, scraping against my skin with every jolt. My ears rang with the cacophony of gunfire and desperate shouts, a stark contrast to the eerie silence that had preceded the ambush. When my vision finally cleared, I saw my squad members in defensive positions, their faces etched with determination and fear. They were firing towards distant shadows, figures obscured by the haze of the desert heat. We were on a slight incline, a vantage point about a mile away from the smoldering remains of our convoy. The scene was one of utter devastation. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning metal and rubber. Scattered around the wreckage were our assailants, easily distinguishable in their eclectic mix of traditional Arabic clothing and military gear. It was apparent that we had been overwhelmed by their numbers, forcing us to retreat to this precarious position. They were systematically firing in our direction while simultaneously scavenging through the remnants of our cargo. Amongst the chaos, I noticed several of them attempting to force open the largest crate, the primary focus of our mission. With effort, I managed to get to my feet and grabbed my rifle, joining my squad in the firefight. I took aim at the figures surrounding the crate, my heart pounding as I squeezed the trigger. I managed to hit one, watching as his comrades hastily dragged him to cover, but they did not cease their efforts to open the crate. Mr. Jefferson, who until now had been an enigmatic presence, was actively firing beside me. Amidst the chaos, he yelled out, emphasizing the importance of preventing the crate from being opened. We concentrated our firepower, but our efforts were in vain. The assailants had managed to pry the crate half open, and what followed seemed like a nightmare come to life. The crate's door suddenly burst outward from the inside, hitting one of the attackers with such force that he was thrown several feet into the air. From within, a creature emerged. It was massive, resembling a grotesquely mutated dog, its movements a blur of deadly precision. It tore through the attackers with a ferocious rage that was chilling to witness. The beast's killing spree was brutal and swift. It lunged at one man, biting off his limb in a spray of blood. Another assailant was disemboweled within seconds, his insides spilling onto the desert sand. The air was filled with the sickening sounds of flesh being torn and bones being crushed. As the creature wreaked havoc, the attackers' focus shifted from us to the new threat. Their screams of terror mingled with the sound of gunfire as they desperately tried to fend off the beast. The scene before us was one of pure carnage, the ground quickly turning into a gruesome tableau soaked in blood. In the midst of this horror, panic set in among the bandits, and they began to flee. The creature pursued them relentlessly, its fury unrelenting. Mr. Jefferson's voice cut through our shock, urging us to move. I nodded, snapping out of my dazed state, and quickly assessed our situation. A roll call revealed the heart-wrenching cost of the ambush. Corporal Smith, always the one to lighten the mood, and Senior Lieutenant Avertley, the embodiment of stoicism, were both gone. Their absence created a void that was felt deeply by every member of our squad. Additionally, one of the government officials had been killed. Our numbers were now reduced to 8, including 2 wounded and 4 remaining government agents. I radioed for backup, receiving confirmation that help would arrive in 6 hours. Our immediate priority was to distance ourselves from the chaos and the unknown horror we had unleashed. The only remaining vehicle, an MRAP, had been rendered inoperable during our retreat. We salvaged what we could: stretchers for the wounded, essential equipment, ammunition, and most importantly, water. In the unforgiving desert, water was as valuable as life itself. The realization that we needed to evacuate immediately was unanimous. The creature, a living embodiment of terror, posed a threat we were ill-equipped to handle. It was a force of nature, unpredictable and deadly. As we prepared to leave, the gravity of our situation weighed heavily on us. The burning vehicles behind us were a grim reminder of the day's events, a testament to the chaos we had narrowly escaped. Yet there was no time for mourning or reflection. Survival was our only objective. I activated the GPS beacon to ensure that rescuers could locate us. With the wounded securely on the stretchers, we began our arduous journey. The desert stretched out before us, vast and unyielding, its beauty marred by the violence that had just unfolded. After trekking approximately 10 grueling miles through the rugged canyon, our weary group finally emerged onto the open desert. We trudged alongside the highway, a desolate stretch where no vehicles dared to travel. The heat was oppressive, its intensity unrelenting, as we took turns carrying our wounded comrades, our strength waning with every step. As dusk began to blanket the sky, we were on the verge of setting up camp when a flicker of lights in the distance caught our attention. In the heart of the desert stood a solitary structure. Drawing closer, we found ourselves before an old yet beautifully crafted Arab stone house. It was a 2-story building with a small courtyard in front, and the doors stood invitingly open, illuminated by the warm glow of lights inside. I recognized it as a typical Syrian tavern, a haven for travelers braving the desert's harshness. The house featured a central courtyard enclosed by high walls, offering a secluded sanctuary. A fountain adorned its center, surrounded by lush greenery, a serene oasis amidst the sweltering desert. We cautiously entered the courtyard, where I noticed a bell next to the door. Ringing it, we were soon greeted by the house's owner. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, with a well-groomed beard and dark hair slightly tinged with gray. His skin was weathered from the Syrian sun, giving him a rugged yet wise appearance. Dressed in traditional garb, a flowing robe and a taqiyya, he exuded a welcoming aura. He introduced himself as Muhammad. We explained our need for a room, water, and clean bandages to tend to our wounded. Muhammad's gaze swept over us, pausing briefly on the government officials. Then he nodded and soon returned with the requested items. We tended to the wounds, thankfully minor, and Muhammad then offered us a meal. The food was simple but nourishing. Unleavened bread, olives, laban, a thick sour milk believed to have healing properties, and Arab sandwiches, flatbreads filled with finely chopped onion, parsley, and bits of meat. We ate gratefully and thanked our host. He nodded in response and showed us to our rooms. The government officials took one room, while our squad divided among the remaining 2. Soon, a peaceful quiet settled over the house. After everyone else had drifted off to sleep, I told Lieutenant Smith, who was on watch, that I wanted to explore the surroundings. Stepping outside into the cool night air, I felt a refreshing change from the day's blistering heat. The sky was a tapestry of stars, offering a moment of tranquility. I decided to walk around the house. As I rounded a corner, I stumbled upon a small grove of trees with a well at its center. Curious, I approached the well and peered inside. It was too dark to see the bottom, so I pulled out my flashlight and shined it down. To my horror, at the bottom lay a body that had clearly been there for some time. But what chilled me to the bone was the realization that the corpse belonged to Muhammad, the tavern owner I had just met. Gripping my rifle tightly, I rushed back to the rooms. Checking on my squad first, I found nothing amiss. However, upon entering the government official's room, I was met with a shocking scene. Muhammad stood in the center, staring at one of the officials who was pointing a gun at him. As I entered, Muhammad turned his head slightly towards me, then began to shake violently. His body contorted in unnatural ways, bones cracking and reshaping under his skin. The sight was both fascinating and horrifying. First, his face elongated, the jaw stretching forward, the skin rippling and contorting as if something underneath was struggling to break free. His eyes, once warm and inviting, now glowed with a feral yellow light, deep and wild. His mouth widened, lips tearing at the seams to accommodate the growing, sharp teeth that emerged, dripping with saliva. The transformation was not just confined to his face. His limbs lengthened and thickened, muscles bulging and expanding in a grotesque display of power. His fingers elongated into claws, tearing through the fabric of his traditional robe. The sound of his clothing ripping was drowned out by the guttural growls emanating from his throat. His spine arched unnaturally as coarse, dark fur sprouted all over his body, covering him in a thick, animalistic pelt. The once stooped figure of a middle-aged man was now replaced by a hulking, beastly form, towering over everyone in the room. As the transformation completed, the creature that stood before us was a terrifying sight to behold. a werewolf, a mythical being of strength and primal fury. It snarled, revealing a row of razor-sharp teeth, its eyes scanning the room with predatory hunger. The man we had known as Muhammad was gone, replaced by this monstrous entity, a creature of nightmares come to life. The official opened fire, and I quickly ducked for cover so you don't get caught in the crossfire. The creature, now monstrous in form, lunged at one of the officials, biting deep into his throat. The others continued to fire, but their bullets seemed to have little effect. In a panic, they fled the room, leaping over me in their haste, except for one. The monster grabbed his leg, tearing into him with ferocious bites. Frozen in shock, I watched the gruesome scene unfold before regaining my senses and opening fire. Hearing the shots, the rest of my squad rushed in and joined the fray. The beast, agile and seemingly impervious to our bullets, leaped across the walls before smashing through a window and escaping into the night. Silence fell over the house, a haunting stillness that lingered long after the creature's departure. We inspected the victims of the attack, but unfortunately, they had succumbed to their injuries. Fear was evident in the eyes of every member of my squad as we looked around. We decided to barricade ourselves in a room until help arrived. According to the schedule, it should have been soon. I checked the GPS tracker. It was working perfectly. I sighed, overwhelmed by the day's shocking developments. While my subordinates were setting up inside, I decided to survey the surroundings, taking Lieutenant Smith with me. We left the house, scanning the area, aware that the creature could be lurking anywhere. The darkness was on its side. We circled the fountain and were heading towards the exit when a person emerged from around the corner of the fence. We quickly raised our weapons. It was Mr. Jefferson. He sighed with relief upon seeing us and approached. We kept our guns aimed at him, instructing him to raise his hands. Initially surprised, he then understood the situation and complied. I asked him to state his name and he responded. Then I asked him to say my name. His answer was correct, but we weren't sure if the creature couldn't mimic memories. Mr. Jefferson then approached us, claiming he was indeed himself. I grabbed him by the collar and demanded to know what was happening. Up to this point, I had been silent and hadn't asked him about the creature since we were in a hurry to leave the area, but now he needed to explain. He gently freed himself from my grip and, sighing, began his story. They had received a message that locals had found a strange place, something like a tomb or burial site. When they arrived, they found this creature. It was something unreal, supernatural, belonging to no known species. It lay still as if dead, but upon taking samples, they realized it was still alive. They theorized that this creature might be the very ghoul from Arabian legends. The project was quickly classified, and they set up a camp near Palmyra to study it. They conducted experiments on it, trying to understand its nature. They did everything with it, but the creature had incredible regenerative abilities. This intrigued them even more, but then they began to notice signs of the creature awakening. A finger twitched, and when one of the workers saw this, he panicked understandably, as we ourselves had seen how terrifying the monster was. Soon, when they continued their experiments, the creature opened one eye, surveyed each of them, and then closed it again. In shock, they realized it was time to transport the creature to a more secure and fortified location. Unfortunately, the area where the camp was located was in a no-fly zone due to terrorists controlling the airspace, making it dangerous to move by air. So they decided to transport it to Deir ez-Zor and from there to our military base. It was decided to attract as little attention as possible and transport it with a small squad. But apparently someone leaked information about the cargo. though they did not know what we were transporting. As he finished his story, everything fell into place. The puzzle was complete. I began to process what had happened and let my guard down. I didn't notice when someone approached us. It was the last of Mr. Jefferson's surviving colleagues. His face was frightened, and he looked around nervously. Mr. Jefferson, relieved to see him alive, said, "I'm glad you're alive, Jake," and went to pat his shoulder when Jake suddenly swung his hand, and Mr. Jefferson's head rolled onto the floor. I screamed and, raising my rifle, started shooting at the creature. Lieutenant Smith joined in, but the creature, having transformed back into the monster, swiftly jumped to the side and disappeared into the bushes. We kept firing as other soldiers came running out, but we ceased fire. Standing in the darkness, with only the dim light from the lamps illuminating the small courtyard, we were tense, scanning our surroundings. Suddenly, the creature leapt out of the bushes from the other side, flying towards me. Lieutenant Smith, fortunately reacting in time, hit the creature's side with his rifle butt. It saved me. The creature only managed to scratch me. A thin stream of blood trickled down my cheek. The creature flipped in midair and landed skillfully on its hind legs. It then looked at us and was about to attack again when the roar of a helicopter sounded in the sky, and the lights of vehicles approached the inn. Backup had finally arrived. The creature noticed this and roared in frustration, then jumped, grabbed Mr. Jefferson's body, and disappeared into the night. We continued to shoot, but to no avail. We stood in shock, trying to digest what had happened. The realization came to me. This creature wanted to avenge those who had awakened it and experimented on it. Now it had vanished into the night, and we would likely never find it again.